Welcome to the note presentation for Chapter 15, Section 3, Darwin Presents His Case. This is from Chapter 15 in our biology book, which is about Darwin's theory of evolution. Remember to fill in your notes for Chapter 6 or 15, Section 3 as you listen to this presentation. And don't forget that you may pause as you need to complete the notes. You want to make sure you get everything filled in so you have that information. Okay, let's start out with a little learning objective review. Chapter 15, Section 1, the question we talked about was, what was the pattern Darwin observed among organisms of the Galapagos Islands? You do not have to write this down. This is just for review. So just remember that Darwin noticed that the characteristics of many animals and plants varied greatly among the different islands of the Galapagos. Now the learning objectives for this lesson, and there are 5 of them. We are only really going to focus on a couple, but there are 5 learning objectives. 15.3.1, list events leading to Darwin's publication of On the Origin of Species. Describe how natural variation is used in artificial selection. Explain how natural selection is related to species fitness. Identify evidence Darwin used to present his case for evolution. And finally, state Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection. So let's jump right in here. So when Darwin came back from his 5-year trip on the HMS Beagle, he had a lot of information, a lot of ideas, a lot of questions, and he kind of calculated a few theories. What he also did is he started to put together all of this information into a book. And the book was called On the Origin of Species. What happened over time is he kind of waited to publish, and he was receiving a lot of backlash from some scientists in the scientific community. So what he had asked his wife to do was to wait until he died and then to have her publish his book after that. Those were his wishes originally. However, there were many other scientists in the field who were starting to start to turn and lean and get some of the same theories that Darwin was, and Darwin started to get a little nervous that he wouldn't end up getting the credit for all of the hard work that he'd spent. So he did end up publishing the book On the Origin of Species before he died. And in his book, Darwin proposed a mechanism for evolution called natural selection. And he also presented evidence that evolution has been taking place for millions of years. Now, the first part of natural selection is called inherited variation and artificial selection. What we know just by looking out our windows and by looking at the person sitting next to us is that members of each species vary from one another. They all species, nobody looks alike. No two organisms look alike. They might look similar and have similar characteristics, but the members are going to vary a little bit from one another. Darwin also noted that plant and animal breeders would breed only the best organisms. So if they wanted to grow a particular plant that was a particular height, they would only breed plants of that height. If they only wanted to breed certain dogs for certain skills, they would look for the best dogs that had that particular skill. And what he did is he termed this process artificial selection. So that brings us to our first key concept question. How is natural variation used in artificial selection? Well, in artificial selection, nature provides the variation, they provide the differences between organisms, and humans select the variations that they found useful. Okay, so if we look at it in terms of plant growth, okay, this is an ancestral species in the middle. Okay, so this species has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. And what happened over time is breeders looked for certain parts of the plants that grew certain things that they wanted, that they liked, and they started to grow certain plants that only had those characteristics. So from this one plant, over the years, and we're talking hundreds of years, we get Brussels sprouts, cauliflower, broccoli, kale, and kohlrabi. And they all come from the same ancestral species. Just the breeders, the gardeners or the farmers were looking for a specific type of vegetable and they would breed for that vegetable. And now we have those certain vegetables. So that's just an example of artificial selection. Now there is evolution by natural selection. This is a theory that Darwin has in place. And what he did is he compared processes in nature to artificial selection. So with artificial selection, remember, humans are able to pick what characteristics they want and what makes the best plant or the best animal. Darwin, however, developed a hypothesis called natural selection to explain how certain evolution occurs in nature without that human interaction. So the first thing he came around and what he noticed was something called the struggle for existence. And what he noticed is that with certain populations, there were high birth rates. There were also shortages of basic needs, and these things would force organisms to start to compete for food and for shelter. So certain, basic needs and the fact that there was a lot of an organism in a certain area allowed for what we call competition. Um, in uh, in the environment in nature, there's an ability of an individual to survive and reproduce in its environment called fitness. And this is, we kind of call this as the survival of the fittest. And this is where the best, the strongest, the most able to adapt to the environment, these are the organisms that are going to survive. And what we know is that an adaptation is any inherited characteristic that increases an organism's chance of survival. So if there are a bunch of birds that are living in a tree and the tree has only really hard seeds, the birds that have the best beaks for opening those seeds are going to be the ones to survive. The other ones that don't have the same type of beak to get the seeds open, they will end up dying off and probably end up going away. And the adaptation of this beak is going to allow that bird to survive. Now, we also know that there are individuals with characteristics that are not well suited to their environment, and they either die before they can reproduce or they leave very few offspring. Individuals that are better suited to their environment are going to survive and reproduce more successfully. And this was what Darwin called the survival of the fittest. The strongest, um, the most adapted to their environment, they're going to be the ones to continue to survive. So that brings us to our next key concept question, which is how is natural selection related to a species' fitness? And what we know from Darwin is that over time, natural selection results in changes in the characteristics of a population. These changes increase a species' fitness in its environment. Another question that we have to look at is what evidence of evolution did Darwin present? How do we know that these theories he's putting out there Like what are the evidence that he found to support these theories? And Darwin argued that living things have been evolving on Earth for millions of years, and the evidence that he is able to include are the fossil record, which we talked about the fossils in the last section, something called homologous structures, which we'll talk about in a second, and then also um, a similarity in embryology, and we'll also talk about that momentarily as well. So one of the pieces of evolution, the evidence of evolution that Darwin presented are called homologous structures. And basically what that means is that the structures of different organisms, even though they look different on the outside, when you look at them internally, they all have similar structures. Okay, so if we look at each of these, we have the arm of a turtle, the arm of an alligator. This one is the wing of a bird. And this one is the hoof of a mammal, possibly a deer, is kind of what it looks like. And if we look internally at each of these four structures, we notice that even though they look differently, they have similar structures. And the structures that provide similar support and similar purpose in each of these. And it is very possible that the turtle, the alligator, the bird, and some forms of mammal have all over time come from some sort of an ancient type of fish that has the similar structures that they found where this fish is living out in the environment millions and millions of years ago. So this is what part of evolution talks about, is how did the organisms that are around today, the modern organisms, how did they survive so many years ago? And then the last thing that we talked about was similarities in embryology. And what this means is that there's embryos of many animals with backbones are very similar. The same groups of embryonic cells develop in the same order to produce tissues of all vertebrates. So that means that when an organism is developing in the womb, when the mother is still pregnant with the organism, that they develop in the same order, and they look very similar at certain points. So that's what similarities in embryology mean. So then to summarize Darwin's theory, he states that individual organisms differ, organisms produce more offspring than can survive, and organisms compete for limited resources. This is a big piece of his theory. He also states that individuals that are best suited to their environment survive and reproduce. These organisms pass on their heritable traits to their offspring, and this process of natural selection causes species to change over time. Species alive today are descended from ancestors, and this process unites all organisms on Earth into a single tree of life. So those are all of Darwin's theory and kind of the summary of all that he states, and that is in his theory of evolution, his theory of natural selection, and also in his book on the origin of species. Now the last thing we have is a learning objective review. Now remember, you need to listen to get the information, and I'm going to tell you where to find it. Okay? The first question asks, what events lead to Darwin's publication of On the Origin of Species? I want you to cross this one out. We do not need to answer this question. The second one, how is natural variation used in artificial selection? You can go back to that same key concept question and get the answer from that. And then there's another key concept question that asks, how is natural selection related to species fitness? So you will have to go back into your notes to get the answers for those objective reviews out of your key concepts. Thank you for listening. I hope you're able to get all of the information. If not, please go back and pause the video and get all the information that you need to. Thanks.